So please let me introduce our guest. Beginning on the left, of course, is Dr. Tim Soutphommasane. He's the current Race Discrimination Commissioner with the Australian Human Rights Commission, and he's been in that job since 2013, so he's seen a lot of really tough history of late. He's a political philosopher and the author of 4 books on race relations, and his thinking on multiculturalism, national identity, and patriotism has been central to shaping a lot of the debates in Australia and Britain. And I have to add, I really enjoyed his series, Mongrel Nation, which ran 2013 on Radio National, which you can get online if you haven't heard it yet. Dr. Saraid Billiards is director of the research grants team at the National Health and Medical Research Council. She's also a neurophysiologist. She's conducted research into the underlying neuropathology of perinatal brain injury. And she's currently responsible for the NHMRC's Women in Health Science Committee, which was established to tackle some of the progression and retention of women in the health and medical research. And finally, on the far left is Professor Aidan Byrne, who is, as many of you know, the CEO of the Australian Research Council. And his research in nuclear physics uses gamma rays to determine the structure of matter. So maybe he can determine the structure of what's matter with this whole issue. And since coming to the ARC, Aidan has been instrumental in leading their review of gender equality and ARC processes. And I'll throw the first question to Aidan, and that is, what are the strategies prioritized by the ARC for enhancing gender equity, and how might these address the particular challenges facing women and gender minorities in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine in our workforce?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think the theme that we use within our agency, we have a lovely acronym for it, but it's ROPE, Relative Opportunity Performance Evaluation. And indeed, we heard a lot of conversations earlier today about what is merit and so forth. And I think the ARC has a particular responsibility with indeed the NHMRC. We are funders, we are not employers. Mm-hmm. We look after part of the research ecosystem, but only a tiny part of it. And so we have a particular responsibility for making sure that the processes that we have within our agencies are as good as we can with regard to this particular and important issue. And as I say, the vehicle that I think we use most of all is this relative opportunity performance evaluation, taking into account that the track records, the career histories of anyone that comes to us to ask for resources to support their research does take into account the different histories of those people. Unfortunately, although it's very easy to say, it's got a cute acronym, it is actually very hard to start implementing in a serious way. We've been doing it for a number of years now. I think we are having and making inroads into that space in a successful way. One of the clear indicators of that is that in a funding agency, the success rate should be the same for male and female applicants. It is certainly that within the ARC. We get a bit of scatter, of course, but indeed I think within our fellowships programs, the success rate for women is actually even slightly higher than males, and I think I could defend that as an outcome as well. So the relative opportunity performance does allow us to take into account, as I say, different career histories, breaks in careers, which is particularly important. All of those things are very, very critical to get a fair assessment of people in making the decision to award or not award a grant.
And have you taken steps to get the information out to the wider academic community that this process is in place? Because I know a lot of people say, oh no, my grant application will never get funded unless I get some people with, lots of metrics, lots of conferences, and lots of citations.
Absolutely, and myself and all of our EDs and all of our staff, when we go out, probably talk about ROPE as the mechanism for doing that. We now bring in our college members our new college members in particular every year and train them specifically in the rope principles. Very hard to get out to specific assessors who we send work out to, but they are part of the academic community. So pretty well every talk that we give out in the sector does reference back to these rope principles. And I think, as I say, it's a long way to go. It's a twofold problem. I think Peter characterised it very nicely in his discussion how the academy works. There's an assessment problem, but there's also a pool problem, the pool of applicants in the system. Yeah. And they are very, very different and very different issues. In the funding agencies, I think if we get the assessment process as well as we can, that'll help, but it's not the whole solution.
And Saray, the same question. What are the key strategies that your institution has developed to tackle some of these issues?
Yeah, so we have a similar concept in terms of career disruptions and relative to opportunity, but we don't quite have the same outcomes. We're still seeing lower success rates for women across a number of our schemes, which is of concern. So what I thought I would do is just highlight a couple of key things that we're doing at NHMRC. One is at more of a systemic level, and that's part of the review. So someone mentioned it just earlier from Edith Cowan. So we're undertaking a structural review of our funding programs, and it's been interesting listening to the talks today. If you think about the development of these schemes were developed many, many years ago, so typically by men. And we've tweaked around the edges, we've tried to solve some of the issues, but typically they are geared towards your high-performing white men. So one of the key challenges of this review, and I'd really encourage everybody who's affected by funding through the health and medical sphere, is to really put in submissions against this structural review. And one of the key things that are that's on the agenda is looking at how to reform programs that ensures equity for women, for minority groups, ethnicity and so forth. So I think it's really critical. So that's one big structural change that we're looking at. This year, from an individual level, we have implemented for the first time implicit bias training, and the feedback has been okay. I mean, it's the first time, it's a pilot program, we'll see what happens. But I think it's also just very interesting for panel members and assessors just to at least recognise that they've got inherent bias.
So this is for panel members?
This is for panel members and external assessors who look at our programs. So this is the Harvard system that was being developed. So it's a very easy online system, not something that we've generated. But even those who believe that they have no biases will come back and tell us that they have. So that's an interesting process. Always training about what's the definition of career disruptions and things like that. It's really difficult. It's a case-by-case basis, and it's also how well applicants write it into their application. And every time I go out and talk, there's still a little bit of that ingrained idea that if you put down that you've had a career disruption, particularly for women with children, that you will be looked upon badly. And we can only perform change if people put that information in. So it's sort of a bit of a two-way street here. So that's been one thing. Another issue that we find in terms of panel composition, we talked about representation of women and men equal 50-50. We find that extremely hard at NHMRC, and I'd say it would be similar in some aspects at ARC. Particularly for project grants, which is the scheme that I run, where we need at least 500 panel members. We never achieve 50%. But what we're looking at is either new technologies, so video conferencing, for example, so women don't have to leave their homes, they can video conference in. We've also just trialled a new peer review program, so the time that's required to participate in peer review, instead of being 3, 4, 5 days, has been reduced to, at the most that we had last month was 2 hours. So that's a much better time out of your day to be able to participate in that. And then just one other thing, I really liked the word that Elizabeth used this morning about disruption. And so NHMRC will be implementing some disruptive outcomes that I can't really go into too much detail, but some people will be happy about it, some people won't. But I think...
it's cone of silence. You can tell us. Nobody's going to notice.
I know this cone of silence, and I get too many comments. You're so honest, Saray. And I think, oh, shit, what have I done? But just other things, re-entry fellowships, gender equal outcomes, they're all the sorts of things that we're looking at. So that's from an NHMRC perspective.
Tim, this isn't directly one of your areas of responsibility, but you have any thoughts on key strategies that institutions could be looking at, such as the funding bodies and the universities?
Yeah, well, a few have already been touched on, and I'd add from the perspective of the Human Rights Commission, we have a very basic view about human rights, which is that human rights are indivisible. So while I'm, for instance, responsible for racial issues, it's also important for me to advocate on issues concerning gender or disability or age when the opportunities arise. Mick Gooder and I, one of the other commissioners, we're both white ribbon ambassadors, for instance, and this is a good opportunity also to explore the intersectionality which often is at play when we're talking about discrimination and human rights. But from the Human Rights Commission's perspective, really two ways that we do work in this area. One, of course, concerns our advocacy, which constitutes the bulk of the work that commissioners do. We have my colleague Kate Jenkins, who recently started, of course, and she's already hit the ground running with her advocacy on sex discrimination, following in the footsteps, of course, of Elizabeth Broderick. But internally at our organisation, we're unique in some respects. We're a fairly small organisation, which may surprise some. We have 110 staff, the majority of whom are female, and the majority of whom would be under 45. So if we're talking about disruption to work, this is an issue that the organisation really has to deal with on a regular basis. And it's just very common practice for us to think about shuffling staff around and dealing with career disruptions, and that's why we have what I think a robust maternity leave schemes. We emphasise flexibility, so anyone can work from home if the need arises. With electronic communication and technology, this isn't a fundamental obstacle to getting work done. Panel representation is something we're very conscious about, and it can be a challenge from time to time as well. And it's very easy, I think, even for an organisation like ours, which is majority female, to sometimes lapse on that. The other thing I'd point out is just a limitation of our organisation being fairly small and being very tightly resourced. I emphasise the latter. In an ideal world, if we had more resources, I suspect we'd have more sophisticated mechanisms for mentoring and for sponsorship on this issue. We currently don't. They're the sorts of things that we certainly encourage organisations to think about. You need to have, obviously, policies in place, but it's about cultivating the right culture as well in dealing with equity and diversity.
Why is your organisation female-dominated?
It's a good question. I suspect if you were to look at the issues that we deal with and the industries we tend to recruit from, we recruit heavily from the community sector and not-for-profit sector, that might go some way to explaining it. I'm not aware of the professional background breakdown of our organisation, but I would say that the law and social work and other humanities backgrounds would be very overrepresented in our organisation, and that may go some way to explaining why our pool is one that is, pool of applicants for roles and for jobs is dominated by females. And
what is the range of jobs?
Well,
excuse my ignorance for the structure of the commission.
Sure. I mean, there's an administrative part of the organisation which probably is male-dominated. So if we're talking about our IT staff and our finance staff, probably male-dominated. At the commissioner level, which is the executive level, we have a majority of females there currently. We're obviously led by a woman, Professor Gillian Triggs. And then in the policy aspect of the commission, from senior policy roles down to more junior ones, I would say the split would be something like 75-25.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, ours would be the same, actually. Our organisation is also...
Oh, that's fascinating.
But by executive general manager is a woman, my chief financial officer is a woman, my chief program officer is a woman, my chief IT officer is a woman. So it's a characteristic of...
I would say it's not the same at NHMRC.
Speak up, speak up.
That was my career limiting.
Now, data collection is a very important component of the kinds of issues we're talking about. If we don't manage to get the appropriate statement of what the problem is, how are we going to come up with solutions? So I'd like to start with Aidan and then Suraid asking, how do you go about data collection? And then secondarily, how are you thinking about the future in terms of streamlining the data collection process? Aidan?
Well, data collection, I think, is critically important, and we heard this morning how important it is to know the problem. We heard some data from, the census. That's not good enough, but we've actually now, at least in the university sector, got the data, and that's because the ARC also manages, as well as giving out money, it manages an evaluation process, and through that process, this time, for the 2015 exercise, we also asked the question about gender, and that's the first time it's been done. So we now have collected by discipline, by seniority, accurate gender data for the university sector. And were we not in caretaker, we would have published that already. So there's a second volume of our ERA report coming out, which will have, as I say, this breakdown of academic level and discipline for gender. And that's
Can you give us just a summary of what some of the findings are?
Is the leaky pipeline that we have. So across most disciplines, there are the same numbers of males and females right up to the postdoctoral level, so the level A type that, and then it's a linear distribution in the sciences with about 15% at the senior levels, and that's pretty typical across all the sciences. In the humanities subjects, it's a little bit better. There are a number of humanities disciplines where it's roughly 50-50 or at least 40-60. But across the board at senior levels, active researchers strongly diminishing at the senior levels. That's the pool effect that I talked about earlier.
Yeah.
As was mentioned earlier, it is somewhat a generational thing. Aidy's suggestion that he made earlier about the academy, let's park the more senior people, give some space, that's a creative way of doing it. There is no retirement for academics in the system. It is very hard to pipeline out something like that. I think the SAGE measure is going to focus the attention very, very strongly on that issue, and I really, really commend it.
Suraid, same question to you about data collection and streamlining data.
Yeah, so really data for us was the turning point for NHMRC to recognise that there was a problem, and was really the impetus for the formation of our committee. So if we didn't have those data behind us, which demonstrates the exact same problem that Aidan just described, which is also an international problem, we sort of break up our research areas into 4 broad research areas. So our biomedical and clinical science streams certainly have a massive drop-off at more senior levels. Our health services and public health research areas, not so much. But I think if it wasn't for those data, we wouldn't be able to have these discussions that we're having today. And it's really great to see that there's this collective push. We've all got the same story to tell. Like, the data problem is universal, and now it's trying to take those next steps to make those changes.
The other aspect of the data is the transparency. So every time now when we produce an outcomes report for one of our schemes, we include a gender graph with that as well, which plots against seniority as well as just the simple numbers. Very important.
Now, Tim, to you, based on your experience with the Commission, what are some of the key strategies you would recommend to people within the communities that we're talking about today for tackling these issues?
Well, it's got to happen at a number of levels, the work on diversity and equity. You need, first of all, to have solid leadership on it. It makes a big difference if you have messages coming from the top, and not only messages that are done out of lip service, but that are done out of a genuine personal commitment. Getting that passion, of course, is something we can't take for granted, and quite often the task is about ensuring that we can put a human face on an issue in order to win over leadership to the cause, so to speak. At another level, there's obviously policies and practices which need to be identified as the right mechanisms for generating change. Collecting data is absolutely vital. If you think it's difficult collecting data on gender, imagine collecting data on diversity of cultural form. There's very limited data that we have at the moment on cultural diversity, and I find that's an enormous challenge to getting that conversation started, because it can be a source of obfuscation, it can be a source of misunderstanding. If you don't know what is actually happening, if you're not monitoring progress and development, then that opens the field up to all sorts of misconceptions and for the status quo to continue to reign. You need to have targets, in my view. You can't have this conversation around equity and diversity without talking about targets. Once you set numbers, an organisation has to be serious about it. And finally, you need to deal with culture, dealing with bias, whether that's unconscious or conscious. And quite often we prefer to talk about unconscious bias because it's less threatening, but you also need to be unapologetic about the conscious forms of bias that still linger, whether that's to do with gender or race, as I frequently think about. And finally, there's leadership development or professional development more generally. You've got to nurture talent, and it's not enough if you set targets without also having something in place to ensure that those who are brought in have an opportunity to succeed. Because I think we've all been in contexts or in situations where we've seen targets set, perhaps prematurely, without the right support, and the last thing you want to do is to set up an organisation for failure. But bringing those three things together, the philosophy's really got to be about valuing diversity and creating an inclusive organisation, one where people can belong and feel that they can belong without having to sacrifice their sense of identity and who they are, that they're comfortable in their skin.
Now, in the last session, Melanie Thompson talked about the problems dealing with disabilities in the scientific workplace. And one of the problems she mentioned was something I'd like to toss back first to Aidan, and that is performance relative to opportunity. Now, the ARC produces these guidelines on it. Now, we've got to deal with this, we've got to ensure that this is an actual thing. Nevertheless, you still see gender inequities in funding outcomes. So how do you get the message out there that this is an absolutely critical, important part of the pathway to career diversity?
So it's about beating the drum at every occasion, making sure that your process reinforce that when the decisions are happening within the meetings and so forth. It's never letting it go, actually. There's no other way to do it.
Yeah.
There is no simple way to do it. Exposing people we put on our panels in the first instance, mentioned before, doing implicit bias training is part of that, recognising that at every decision point in the tree you have to think about those issues, bringing them to task, setting up processes within the meeting that allow decisions to be made without people thinking, oh, we're changing and destroying the whole system. So over the last couple of years we've changed internally the flow and decision-making process within our panels, that it makes it much easier for the panels to take account of the rope issues, the relative opportunity principles, without thinking, oh my God, we're destroying the merit principle. So separate those two decision-making processes. That requires a bit of thought and planning on how to do it, and then just perpetual beating of the drum about that this is an important issue that you have to take into account at every point in the decision.
And defining clearly what you mean by merit.
Well, again, we heard how hard it was to actually define what merit is, and I think that's right. It is a context-determined concept, and I think one has to be very, very careful about that.
Yes, yes. So, Raid, the NHMRC Women in Health Sciences Workshop, which you hosted in 2015, highlighted a range of particularly challenging issues facing women in medical science. How has the NHMRC followed up on this?
So we're following that workshop. We've gone through some interesting changes. And so for those of you who aren't quite familiar, a lot of our reporting requirements we need to report through to our research committee and council and so forth. So we've gone through a massive change in that. So not that we've had to start from scratch again, but we've really had to make a good case. So there has been a little bit of stalling in that process. But having said that, one of the key things that was really high on the agenda was the mandate, if you like, that we required all institutions that received funding from NHMRC to have gender equity policies and practices in place. This occurred just at around the time that the SAGE announcement was occurring. So in one way, there was a little bit of alarm that we were going to go off and do our thing, SAGE was going to go off and do their thing. But I think really what we had learnt from that exercise is because we had asked institutions for their policies a couple of years prior, and so we have about 80 institutions that seek funding from NHMRC, and very, very few institutions either responded to our request, and those that did, the quality of their submissions was extremely poor. So for us that was a bit of an alarm in that either people just didn't care, that letter got put in the bottom drawer, it wasn't that big a ticket item for them to be discussing. So then when we brought that back and said it's part of your administering institution policy, and to be eligible for that, there was that hint of perhaps if you don't succeed and show us that you're doing well, you won't get funding, a bit like what Dame Sally Davis did. All of a sudden we've had an amazing response. I will say though, 2 institutions still have had no correspondence with us, so they will be 2 institutions that we'll be working quite closely with. But having said that, we're not there to...
By the way, were they group of 8?
No.
That's interesting.
No. Much smaller institutions. But what we're there is, we're not really there to say you've passed or failed. What we would like to do is sort of this philosophy of trying to encourage a little bit of action. And I know there's always a lot of comments, you can have a policy in place, but it doesn't necessarily mean action. And I think I'm hoping that this will dovetail with some of the work that's really going to come out of SAGE as well. So that's going to really be the action, and I'm hoping that we sort of was part of that process of getting that awareness raising. So that's one thing. The other one I'll really just talk about is, that was a key thing for that workshop, was re-entry fellowships. And so this is still key on the agenda, that our research committee is really keen, and as a committee we will be putting in a submission as well to the structural review, and that is that re-entry fellowships of some sort must be part of our future, so we can take into consideration particularly women or men who have taken a career break to look after children. The difficulty at the workshop was the definition of re-entry was so large, so are you coming back from industry or whatever, we can't solve all those problems. I think what we would like to do is sort of start small and then expand, so that would be one of the other key things that has come out of that.
Tim, Principle 6 of the Athena Swan Charter asks organizations to, and here's a quote, commit to addressing the negative consequences of using short-term contracts for the retention and progression of staff in academia, particularly women. So from the perspective of the Commission, what do you see as some of the critical issues for gender equity arising when career paths do rely heavily on short-term contracts?
Well, it's a really serious issue because it can compound the structural disadvantages or imbalances that may already exist. If you need to think about taking that career break or caring for a child or children, and obviously this will be an enormous issue, and it can deter people from seeking careers in certain industries as well. I think that would be the concern that we would have. And it's also an issue where you see some of the intersectionality perhaps emerging as well in some senses. I mean, I think of culturally diverse women who may be relatively new arrivals to Australia or who migrate to Australia, who, for instance, may not have the family networks or support networks that might be readily available. And if you're talking about short-term contracts being the norm, then I'd say that this issue would play out with even more intensity for people from that background. So from my perspective, as Race Commissioner, this is an issue where I see some of the intersectionality playing out, but it goes to the structural challenges that are at play here, and I think if you're talking about these issues, you can't divorce them from the overall big picture, which is that you have to try and shift the system and the structure in some way if you can.
You know, short-termism is a real problem in Australian science, isn't it? From, you know, the overall funding at the political level down to how it's managed at the university level and the institution level. So picking up on that short-term funding thing, Aidan, where do you see the future of STEM career pathways, and how might the sector as a whole be transformed to address this problem of the short-term career paths? It's a toughie. And you've got, again, two dot points to solve this one.
That is a toughie, and it's some ways independent of gender. The short-term issue is for both males and females.
Exactly.
It's an extraordinarily difficult one. I don't see a simple solution for it. I think it's going to be a pattern of behaviour in universities for a long time to come.
Where do we begin, though?
Begin to fix it,
Yeah.
you mean?
Where do you start? These are these huge cultural matters. How do you get
Well,
in
we could go to a 5-year government.
Well, that would be nice.
That would be a good start, actually.
Or make them all be nice to one another and be
that would be good too.
bipartisan.
Bipartisanship would be a wonderful thing to get back to. I should be careful because we're in caretaker mode. I can't make comments like that. But short-termism is actually quite a challenge for the country as a whole.
Yes, absolutely.
A 3-year electoral cycle is actually disastrously short, in my view, and then that permeates all aspects of society, and universities are not exempt from that. So long-term planning is actually very difficult to do when you overlay that on the particular political situation we have in this country. And if it's volatile, it gets much worse, it gets compounded. Universities are not immune from that. They are not going to be able to solve that problem on their own. They do, though, have to think about mechanisms for buffering that as much as they can. That is going to be extraordinarily difficult to do, but they have to try. It's exacerbating too when you map it into the gender dimension. I think, as Tim just said, it compounds the problem in that space, because more than likely it is the women, when they are trying to have a family, are slightly more suited to having a short-term contract, but that comes back and bites you severely in the longer term.
Yeah.
So at that point, institutions have to be doubly vigilant and aware of the issue, and one would hope that these SAGE initiatives will particularly target that dimension. And then it comes back into our domain, in the funder domain, that when we look at track records, when we look at the history of applicants to us, we properly take into account all of that break in career, short-term contracts that people have, to try and get to the heart of the quality of both the proposal and the applicant.
Yeah.
And I don't pretend it's easy. It's actually going to be really, really difficult, but you've got to do all of it at the same time.
Yeah. So, Ray, do you want to add to that from the perspective of the NH&MRC?
Yeah, look, I would agree it's difficult, but I think a couple of things that I would say that NHMRC needs to look at is sometimes around the terminology that we use, particularly for our fellowships programs. This term career trajectory, it would be something that I'd like to remove because it goes against those women who are either just maintaining their research output whilst having children, looking after their families. I think, we can look towards other metrics, which would be your, top 5 out of your 5 years, or rather than numbers. So I think there are other ways we can look at that. And this is something that I often always say, and not always everybody agrees with me, but I think going back to when I was doing my PhD, if I had have been educated just how many skills you have as a PhD individual candidate that can be applied across many different sectors. I think if you can get out of the mindset, and I'm not saying we shouldn't continue in research, but I think it makes decision making so much easier that you don't feel like you have no choice. But
What do you mean by sectors in that context?
So, you know, if I had have known one day that my career would have ended up at NHMRC, but it wasn't a conscious decision that I had the skills that would be transferable. So I think particularly as a biomedical scientist, you're trained to be in the lab, to continue in the lab, you do your postdoc, you have your lab, you run your lab and whatever. It's not for everybody, but I think if we were armed with a bit of that information at the earlier days, I think the decision making would be less tough. It's better to be informed than not.
Now, I have one final question I'd like to pose to all of the panelists before we throw open to questions, and I'll start with you, Tim. And that is, what can you see as some of the key initiatives that could be introduced to allow funding bodies and research institutions to better share the responsibilities and work together to improve gender equity as a whole, allow for more equitable career pathways, and take the sector forward?
Well, touched upon just then, I think getting the nuance right around terminology and language is important, and if there are ways of dealing with grants or contracts and whatnot by having clauses that have teeth in there, then that can really shift things along. To draw an analogy with another industry, in media, for instance, Screen Australia and other bodies which are grant-giving bodies find that recipients or applicants for grants will respond very powerfully to certain requirements. And this has certainly been the case in the past where there have been clauses around diversity included in grant funding. So it's the sort of thing that research bodies and grant-giving bodies can do, and there's a lot of influence,
into their
a lot of influence and power there. But as to what specifically can be done, I suspect I don't know enough about higher education and research and the mechanics of it to really know. So I'll defer to my esteemed colleagues here on the panel.
Esteemed colleague, Sareed?
So I think we're at a timely place now. There seems to be this lovely groundswell and we're all coming together, and I think everyone agrees. I think back 5 years ago when I was looking at data from NHMRC and trying to present the issue, it was still a bit of it's not that big a deal. So I think, we've got lots of fabulous bodies in different sectors. We've got SAGE, we've got the work that we're doing. I think we just need to work collectively. And collectively as one voice is much more powerful than many individual voices that are a bit quieter. So I don't think there's a buck, passing the buck going on. I think we just all know that this is everybody's job and everybody's responsibility. And if we work together, hopefully we'll see a change. I'd like to see a change for my daughter. So fingers crossed that'll happen.
I'd like to see a change for everybody here.
Oh, well, that too.
Aidan?
Well, I think, and I've come here and I've been very heartened, and I picked up this brochure this morning, and because of the position I have, I look at a list like this, and I'm talking specifically about the universities because it's the sector that we fund. And I went through that list, and as I go through a list like that, I see the names on it, and I just was blown away because somebody said, oh, we've got 70%. Actually, we've got much more than that on that list of activity in this country in the SAGE initiative, and it's been enormously heartening to see how the SAGE initiative has developed over the years, and that's absolutely tremendous. And I'm going to do something that's probably career limiting here because, as I say, when I looked at this list, I saw the names on it, but I actually saw the names that aren't on it. And it is interesting to think about it because there's some good reasons why they might not, an institution, a university might not be on it. This is about STEM. Not every institution does STEM, so they might not want to do it. Some are very small and so forth. What I want to see, what I think is really important, is that the next time we have a meeting like this, everyone's signed up to this list.
Here.
And so I'm making a plea to these universities, think about this hard. So there is a university on there that I can't imagine why it's not on there, and that's the University of Adelaide. It is a group of 8, it's not on the list. And forgive me if there is it on the list and I haven't seen it. Bachelor's not on there, I could probably forgive them. Murdoch's not on there. University of Southern Queensland's on there. Victoria University's not on there. Torrens University's not on there. University of New England's not on there. CDU's not on there. Central Queensland University's not on there. University of Divinity's not on there. Perhaps give that one away. Australian Catholic University's not on there. And Notre Dame's not on there. Can we see them next time?
It's good. We're going to questions now, so I feel that a response is required. Could we get a microphone to you and identify yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Margaret Hartley. I'm the CEO of ATSI. It's not for me to defend anybody who needs to get onto SAGE, but it's a pilot program, Aidan, and to be fair, not everybody has been allowed to join us. So we do have a waiting list. It's been a tough process to only take on the 22 and the 8, so we have 40, and we're expecting everybody next time we see you to be lined up to do that. It's been because we started with a small pilot that's expanded beyond our wildest beliefs, and we are very enthusiastically catching up, and I know the new executive director's got that firmly in hand. So the list you read is not because they're not interested. In fact, they're probably very disappointed with our capacity to take them on. And
but isn't that exciting?
It is exciting, so it's great.
Yeah, and that's really good.
And a question, we'll have to go to the right first, I'm sorry. Could we get a microphone to the woman in the green jacket?
Hello, Renee Ryan from the University of Sydney. First of all, I'd like to congratulate both Sareed and Aidan on the improvements relative to opportunity and career disruption that have occurred, I think, in both of your funding bodies. But I suppose something that you mentioned, Aidan, is the pool problem, which is a really big problem because we see that most of the people that are successful in both schemes are more senior, and because of the issues we have, they're generally men, or many more men get grants and fellowships. And so one thing that I've always thought of is why can't we split the funding system up by stage, and so that people that are 0 to 20 years postdoc compete with each other, and then people that are more senior compete with each other, because I think it's really difficult for both men and women at the early stages to be competing with these really established people, and particularly with the NHMRC where you can hold 6 grants. I mean, these people have huge groups and a lot of money, and so is there, I know it's kind of disruptive, but I think is there some way that we can actually get people more competing with each other?
Well, I'd never countenance a mechanism where people can hold 6 grants, and that's something the NHMRC can deal with, and the ARC deliberately doesn't support that. And our DECRAs, for instance, we have 200 DECRAs that's there for people 0 to 5 years post-PhD, and if you're a carer, we extend that period. If you're a carer, even if you've had a break, we'll extend it, but even if you're just a carer, we will extend that eligibility period. So we are trying to look after people at different stages in the career. We also, in the ARC, are not seeing what some people are seeing around the world, and that's a continual ageing of who we award to. We are still actually preserving a fairly flat average age of investigators on our program, so we're not seeing a ramping up too severely into the most senior way. So I think we've got our balance somewhat right, without actually making it even more difficult and partitioning the money. When you partition, it actually creates complications and problems. We do try and keep it simple. Our DECRAs are there to try and focus on that younger group of people. Our future fellows are there, and now in the ARC we have an ongoing future fellowship scheme that's absolutely fantastic. This is for mid-career researchers. Sadly, mid-career these days means 40 plus. I mean, it's really quite scary, actually. But they are there, particularly targeted into that age cohort.
So, Raid, and by way of wrapping up this session, do you have something you'd like to add to that question?
Look, it's a difficult question. I mean, we try to build into some of certainly in our fellowship schemes, it's the same. Our project scheme, we have the new investigator program. It has its limitations around it as well. But I think, like I said earlier, we also see very different profiles between our broad pillars, if you like. So it's I think it is a little bit complex, but I would encourage, though, everybody, if you're eligible for a new investigator, to put in for a new investigator, because your chances of getting funded are much better than a standard project grant. And I know there are some institutions who don't recommend their students apply or researchers apply for a new investigator, and I'm not quite sure why that would be. Anywho.
And thank you to all of you, and thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody. So please put your hands together and say thank you.